Story 1. White Lady of West High. I never believed in ghosts until I became the night security guard at West High School in Anchorage. 3 weeks into the job, I wished I had stayed ignorant. The call came at 2 in the morning. Motion sensors had triggered in the main auditorium, and protocol required a physical check. I grabbed my flashlight and radio, telling myself it was probably just a raccoon that had wandered in through a broken window. Small-town schools like this one always had issues with wildlife. The hallways stretched endlessly under my beam of light, lined with decades of student photos and peeling motivational posters. My footsteps echoed against the worn linoleum, each sound seeming to multiply in the darkness ahead of me. The heating system groaned through ancient pipes, creating a symphony of unsettling noise that made every shadow feel alive. I had worked security for 15 years in various buildings around Anchorage, but West High felt different. Built in the 1940s, it carried the weight of countless stories within its brick walls. During my first week, other guards had warned me about strange occurrences, but I dismissed their tales as the typical folklore that haunts old buildings. Every place has its ghost stories, I reasoned. Every security guard thinks they have seen something unexplainable. The auditorium doors stood slightly ajar, which was impossible. I had personally checked them during my earlier rounds, ensuring they were locked tight. A cold draft whispered through the gap, carrying with it the faint scent of old perfume and something else I could not identify. Something that reminded me of flowers left too long in stagnant water. I pushed the doors open and stepped inside. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing rows of empty red velvet seats that seemed to stretch into infinity. The stage loomed before me, its heavy curtains drawn closed like the mouth of some sleeping beast. Everything appeared normal, yet every instinct in my body screamed that something was terribly wrong. That was when I saw her. She stood in the center aisle, perhaps 30 feet away from me, perfectly still and facing the stage. A woman in a white dress that seemed to glow with its own pale light. Her long hair hung straight down her back, dark against the luminous fabric. She did not acknowledge my presence, did not turn when my flashlight found her, did not react to my sharp intake of breath. My hand trembled as I reached for my radio. The rational part of my mind insisted this had to be a student playing a prank, or perhaps a homeless person who had found her way inside. But something about her stillness, her impossible whiteness in the darkness, filled me with a dread I had never experienced before. Before I could speak into the radio, she began to move. Not walking, exactly, but gliding between the seats with fluid grace that defied natural movement. She passed through my beam of light as if it were nothing more than mist, and I caught a glimpse of her profile. Her skin was pale as bone, her eyes dark hollows and a face that seemed both beautiful and terrible. She vanished into the shadows near the stage, and I found myself alone again with only the sound of my ragged breathing and the thundering of my own heart. I swept my flashlight across every corner of the auditorium, searching desperately for any sign of her, but she was gone as completely as if she had never existed at all. I should have left immediately. I should have radioed for backup or called the police. Instead, I found myself walking down the center aisle, drawn by a compulsion I could not explain. Each step took me closer to where she had stood, and with each step, the temperature seemed to drop another degree. The floorboards beneath my feet creaked with age, and somewhere in the building, a door slammed shut with tremendous force. The sound echoed through the auditorium like a gunshot, followed immediately by the unmistakable noise of footsteps in the corridor behind me. Heavy, deliberate footsteps that seemed to be approaching the auditorium doors. I spun around, my light dancing wildly across the seats, but I saw nothing. The footsteps continued, growing louder and more distinct. They had a strange rhythm to them, a shuffling quality that reminded me of someone dragging their feet across the floor. Accompanying the footsteps was another sound, soft but persistent, the whispered scraping of something being pushed across linoleum. A broom. Someone was sweeping the hallway outside. The janitor, I thought with relief. It had to be the janitor making his rounds. But even as the logical explanation formed in my mind, I remembered that the cleaning crew finished their work before midnight. No one else should have been in the building except for me. The sweeping sound grew closer, and I could hear it clearly now. Long, methodical strokes across the floor, followed by the soft tap of bristles against the wall. The footsteps had stopped, but the sweeping continued with mechanical persistence. Back and forth, as if whoever was out there intended to clean the same spot forever. I forced myself to walk toward the auditorium doors, my legs feeling like lead with every step. The sweeping sound was directly outside now, just beyond the threshold. I could see the shadow of movement through the gap beneath the doors, a dark shape passing back and forth in perfect rhythm. My hand shook as I reached for the door handle. The metal was ice cold against my palm, so cold it burned. I pulled the door open and stepped into the hallway, my flashlight held high and ready. The corridor stretched empty in both directions. No janitor, no broom, no sign that anyone had been there at all. But the air still held the faint scent of industrial cleaning solution. And when I looked down at the floor, I could see fresh streaks in the dust where a broom had recently passed. I stood there for several long minutes, trying to process what I had witnessed. The rational explanations crumbled one by one in my mind. No prankster could have disappeared so completely. No homeless person could have moved with such otherworldly grace. And no living janitor worked the halls of West High at 2:30 in the morning. Over the following weeks, I learned that I was not the first to encounter the woman in white. A careful investigation of incident reports and conversations with longtime staff revealed a pattern of sightings stretching back decades. Students had glimpsed her during late rehearsals. Teachers had seen her wandering empty classrooms after hours, and every night security guard who had worked the building for more than a month had a story to tell. They called her the White Lady, and her appearances were always the same. She moved through the school with purpose, as if searching for something she could never find. She was drawn particularly to the auditorium, where she would stand among the seats or pace the stage like an actress who had forgotten her lines. Sometimes she would be seen backstage, her pale figure barely visible among the ropes and pulleys that controlled the curtains. The phantom janitor was equally consistent in his manifestations. Former employees spoke in hushed tones about the sound of sweeping that echoed through the halls long after the cleaning crew had gone home. Some claimed to have seen him, a stooped figure in coveralls pushing an ancient broom with single-minded determination. He appeared most often in the main lobby, forever cleaning the same patch of floor near the trophy cases. I tried to research the history of these spirits, but the school records were frustratingly incomplete. Several staff members had died over the decades, but none of their deaths seemed to match the descriptions of our ghostly inhabitants. The White Lady remained particularly mysterious, with no clear connection to any former student or teacher who might have met a tragic end. What disturbed me most was the effect these encounters had on witnesses. I discovered that several guards before me had quit without explanation, some after working only a few shifts. Teachers who had taught at West High for decades would suddenly refuse to stay after hours, claiming vague excuses about family obligations or health concerns. Even the most skeptical staff members would go pale when the conversation turned to unexplained phenomena in the school. One veteran teacher, Mrs. Henderson, had worked at West High for 37 years. She finally agreed to speak with me about her experiences, but only after I promised never to use her name in any official report. What she told me changed my understanding of the haunting completely. She had seen the White Lady dozens of times over the years, always in the auditorium or the corridors that led to it. But Mrs. Henderson had also witnessed something else, something that none of the other accounts had mentioned. She had seen the White Lady interact with the phantom janitor on several occasions, always in the same disturbing manner. The janitor would be sweeping his eternal path when the White Lady would appear. She would approach him slowly, her movements filled with what Mrs. Henderson described as desperate pleading. The janitor would stop his work and turn to face her, and for a moment, they would stand perfectly still, two spirits locked in some kind of communication that the living could not understand. Then the janitor would shake his head slowly and return to his sweeping, while the White Lady would let out a sound that Mrs. Henderson described as the most heartbreaking wail she had ever heard. A sound of loss so profound that it seemed to come from the very walls of the building itself. This interaction suggested that the hauntings were connected, that these two spirits were bound together by some unfinished business or unresolved tragedy. But what that connection might be remained a mystery that decades of witnesses had failed to solve. My own encounters with the White Lady continued throughout my time at West High. She appeared to me at least once a week, always in the auditorium, always following the same pattern of behavior. She would stand among the seats or glide across the stage, her presence filling the air with an almost tangible sadness. I began to feel that she was trying to communicate something, some urgent message that I was too limited to understand. The phantom janitor was equally persistent. His sweeping would echo through the halls several times each night, always accompanied by the sound of those shuffling footsteps. I learned to recognize the pattern of his rounds, the specific areas where his cleaning ritual was most intense. The main lobby, the hallway outside the auditorium, and a small storage closet near the stage where cleaning supplies had once been kept. After 6 months on the job, I finally experienced the interaction that Mrs. Henderson had described. I was conducting my midnight rounds when I heard the familiar sound of sweeping coming from the main lobby. Following the noise, I arrived just in time to see both spirits together for the first time. The janitor stood near the trophy cases, his broom held loosely in hands that seemed more shadow than substance. He was exactly as the other witnesses had described him, stooped with age, wearing coveralls that had once been blue but now appeared gray in the dim light. His face was turned downward, focused on the floor he had been cleaning for decades. The white lady emerged from the auditorium corridor, moving with that same fluid grace I had observed so many times before. But now her movements carried a different quality, an urgency that made the air itself seem to vibrate with tension. She approached the janitor with obvious purpose, and when she reached him, both spirits became perfectly still. What happened next defied every rational explanation I had ever clung to. The white lady raised her hand and pointed toward the auditorium, her gesture filled with unmistakable pleading. The janitor looked up from his work for the first time I had ever seen, and his face was the most sorrowful thing I had ever witnessed. It was the face of a man carrying guilt so heavy that it had followed him beyond death. He shook his head slowly, just as Mrs. Henderson had described, and the white lady, its response was exactly what I had been told to expect. The wail that came from her seemed to originate from everywhere and nowhere, a sound of loss that penetrated my bones and left me shaking with sympathy I could not explain. Then they were gone, both of them, leaving me alone in the lobby with only the lingering scent of old perfume and cleaning solution. But in that moment of witnessing their interaction, I finally understood something that changed everything about my perception of the haunting. The white lady was not searching randomly through the school. She was asking the janitor for help with something specific, something connected to the auditorium. And his refusal, his eternal refusal, was the source of her endless wandering and his endless cleaning. They were locked in a cycle of guilt and pleading that had persisted for decades, neither spirit able to find peace until some unknown resolution was achieved. I left my position at West High School the following week. The experience had become too intense, too personally affecting for me to continue. But I have never forgotten the white lady or the phantom janitor, and I carry their story with me as a reminder that some mysteries are too profound for the living to solve. They remain there still, I am certain, playing out their eternal drama in the dark halls of West High, waiting for someone who might finally understand what they need to find peace. Sometimes, late at night when sleep eludes me, I can still hear the sound of that broom sweeping across linoleum, and I wonder if they will ever find the resolution they seek. Story 2. Memory keepers. I never believed in past lives until my 4-year-old twins made me question everything I thought I knew about death. My name is Sarah Chen, and 3 months ago, I moved to a nameless village in northern Alaska with my children, Emma and Jake. My husband died in a car accident back in Seattle, and I needed somewhere quiet to heal. The insurance money bought us a small cabin on the edge of nowhere, population 43 souls counting us. The village had no official name. Locals called it simply Here, or the settlement. It sat frozen between mountains and endless forest, where winter lasted 8 months and darkness swallowed the world for weeks at a time. Perfect for disappearing from grief, but some places remember things they should forget. The first strange thing happened during lunch on a Tuesday in October. I was making grilled cheese sandwiches when Emma suddenly stopped eating. Her face went pale, and tears started rolling down her cheeks. She was staring out our kitchen window at the abandoned house across the dirt road. That house had been empty for decades. Weathered gray wood, broken windows, a roof caving in from snow damage. The local store owner, Old Pete, told me a family lived there once, but something terrible happened. Knelt beside Emma in his chair. Her little hands were shaking. "Sweetheart, what is wrong?" Emma looked at me with eyes too old for her face. Her voice came out flat and distant, like she was reading from a script. "When I was grandma's age, my whole family got dead, and I was all alone." The words hit me like ice water. 4-year-olds don't to talk like that. They don't use phrases like, "got dead," with such matter-of-fact sadness. I glanced at Jake, expecting him to look confused like any normal child would. Instead, Jake nodded slowly and patted his sister's hand. "Oh yeah, you were sad. That's why I brought you with me." Then they both went back to eating their sandwiches like nothing happened. like they hadn't just described some impossible shared memory from a life before they were born. I sat there watching them chew, my heart hammering against my ribs. The rational part of my mind searched for explanations. Maybe they overheard something. Maybe it was just kid imagination running wild. But deep down, I knew I had heard something else entirely. That night, after the twins were asleep, I walked to Old Pete's store. The wind howled through the mountains, carrying the scent of approaching snow. Pete was closing up, counting the day, his meager earnings under a flickering fluorescent light. I told him what Emma and Jake had said. Pete, his weathered face went gray. He locked the store door and motioned me to follow him to his truck. We drove in silence to the abandoned house, our headlights cutting through the darkness. Pete parked but didn't get out. Happened in 1987, he said finally. Family named Morrison lived there. Mother, father, and their 4-year-old twins. Boy and girl, just like yours. My stomach clenched. What happened to them? Pete, his knuckles were white on the steering wheel. Carbon monoxide leaked from a faulty heater. Whole family died in their sleep except for one of the twins. Little girl named Emma Morrison. She survived 3 days alone with the bodies before we found her. The name hit me like a physical blow. My Emma, same name, the surviving twin died a week later in the hospital. Doctors said there was nothing medically wrong with her. She just stopped eating, stopped talking, like she didn't want to live without her family. I stared at the dark house, imagining a little girl wandering those rooms, calling for parents who would never answer. Pete, what were their names? The twins. He turned to look at me, and I saw fear in his eyes. Emma and Jake Morrison. The world tilted sideways. My children had the same names as dead twins from 37 years ago. Not similar names, identical names. I had chosen those names randomly, or so I thought. Had something else guided my choices? Over the following weeks, more details emerged. Emma started talking about the cold time when she was hungry and scared. She described the layout of the Morrison house with impossible accuracy, down to the broken floorboard by the kitchen sink. Jake drew pictures of a man and woman he called our old mama and papa, even though he'd only ever known me and his father. The villagers began avoiding us. I caught them whispering, crossing themselves when they saw my children playing. Some left food on our doorstep like offerings, but they wouldn't look me in the eye. I tried to convince myself it was coincidence. Children are imaginative. Maybe they picked up details somehow. Maybe I was losing my mind from grief and isolation. Then I found the photographs. They were hidden in a shoebox under loose floorboards in our cabin, this bedroom. Black and white pictures from the 1980s. The Morrison family. The father looked exactly like my dead husband. The mother had my face, my hair, my smile. And the children. The children were my Emma and Jake. Not similar, identical. Same dimples, same cowlicks, same tiny scar on Jake, his forehead from when he fell off his tricycle last year. Except Jake, his scar appeared in a photograph taken 5 years before he was born. I sat on the cabin floor, surrounded by impossible evidence. The pictures showed birthday parties, Christmas mornings, ordinary moments from a family that died decades ago. A family that looked exactly like mine. That is when I understood the terrible truth. We had to move to this village by accident. Something had drawn us here. Something that needed to finish what had started in 1987. The Morrison twins had died together, but they were meant to live together. They were meant to have the family they lost. My children weren't just remembering past lives. They were completing an interrupted one. The next morning, I found Emma and Jake standing in the Morrison house. I don't know how they got inside. The door had been locked, boarded up for years. But there they were, holding hands in what used to be the living room, talking to empty air like they were greeting old friends. We're home now, Emma said when she saw me. Jake smiled. We brought our new mama and papa back too. I realized with growing horror that they weren't talking about me and my dead husband. They were talking about the Morrison parents, the ones who died from carbon monoxide poisoning 37 years ago. Because standing behind my children, translucent but unmistakably real, were two figures I recognized from the photographs. The Morrison parents had been waiting all these years for their family to return. And now we were all here, drawn by some cosmic force that doesn't understand the difference between life and death, between then and now. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The ghostly figures smiled and opened their arms. Emma and Jake ran to them, laughing like they were reuniting with beloved relatives after a long trip. The last thing I remember is the sound of the door closing behind us, sealing us inside the house where the Morrison family died. The villagers found our cabin empty 3 days later. No signs of struggle, no indication where we went. They searched the mountains, the forest, even the frozen lake. They never thought to look in the Morrison house. Because officially, that house has been empty since 1987. But sometimes, on quiet evenings when the wind is still, people walking past claim they can see lights in the windows. They hear the sounds of a family having dinner, children laughing, parents telling bedtime stories. The Morrison family is complete now. We're all together, just like we were meant to be. The twins got their wish. They brought everyone home. And in this place where time moves differently, where the dead dawn to stay buried and the past bleeds into the present, will never be separated again. Some families are bound by more than blood. Some families are bound by destiny, by tragedy, by forces that transcend death itself. One of those families now. We always were. Story 3. Kuskokwim shadow people. The shadow was walking upstream against a 40-mile-per-hour wind. And when I looked into its face, I saw my own death reflected back at me. My name is David Chen, and I work for the Alaskan Department of Health and Social Services. 3 months ago, I was sent to investigate a cluster of unexplained deaths in the villages along the Kuskokwim River. What I found there changed everything I thought I knew about the remote communities of the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta. The assignment seemed routine at first. 5 villages reporting abnormally high rates of depression, anxiety, and what the local health workers called failure to thrive syndrome. People were getting sick for no apparent reason. Losing weight, sleeping too much or not at all. Some just stopped talking entirely and sat staring out their windows at the river. The pattern had started in Aniak, the largest village in the region, then spread downstream to Kalskog, to Luksik, and finally to the smaller settlements near the mouth of the Kuskokwim. In each village, the symptoms appeared suddenly and affected people seemingly at random. Young and old, healthy and sick, native and non-native. No common factors except geography. My job was to identify the cause. Environmental contamination, maybe, or a new strain of virus spreading through the interconnected communities. I packed my testing equipment and flew into Aniak on a cold Tuesday morning in late September, expecting to spend a week collecting water samples and interviewing patients. I had no idea I was walking into something that predated modern medicine by thousands of years. The first person I met was Dr. Sarah Kameroff, the regional health coordinator and a lifelong resident of the area. She picked me up at the tiny airstrip in her battered pickup truck and drove me through the village while explaining the situation. Aniak looked like most rural Alaskan communities. Scattered houses connected by dirt roads, a few stores, a school, and a health clinic. About 600 people living on the banks of a river that stretched 900 miles from the mountains to the sea. But something felt wrong from the moment I arrived. The village was too quiet, too empty. Even accounting for the small population, I should have seen more people going about their daily business. Instead, the streets were almost deserted, and the few residents I did see moved with a strange lethargy, like they were walking through thick water. Dr. Kameroff noticed my confusion and explained that most people were staying indoors during daylight hours. The sick ones claimed that being outside made their symptoms worse, especially near the river. They complained of feeling watched, followed, and threatened by something they could not name or describe. She took me to the health clinic to review the medical records. What I found there defied every principle of epidemiology I had learned in graduate school. The affected patients showed no signs of infection, no abnormal lab results, no physical symptoms that could explain their psychological decline. Their blood work was normal. Their vital signs were stable. By every measurable standard, they were perfectly healthy. But they were dying anyway. Not from disease or injury, but from something much harder to quantify. They were losing the will to live, eating less each day until they stopped eating entirely, speaking less each week until they fell completely silent. Some had been found dead in their beds with no apparent cause, their bodies showing no signs of trauma or illness. Dr. Kameroff showed me photographs of the deceased, and I noticed something disturbing. They all had the same expression frozen on their faces, eyes wide with terror, mouths open as if they had been screaming when death took them. But the autopsies revealed nothing abnormal. Heart failure, the report said. Cause unknown. That evening, she took me to meet with the village elders. 3 elderly women who had lived in Aniak their entire lives and remembered stories their grandmothers had told them about the old days. They sat in a circle in the community center, speaking in low voices about things that had no place in a government health report. They told me about the tulparut, the shadow people who walked along the riverbanks when the light began to fade. Tall, dark figures that moved against the wind and cast no reflections in the water. The elders said they had always been there, lurking at the edges of human perception, but something had made them bolder in recent months. More aggressive, more hungry. According to the old stories, the tulparut fed on human misery. They could drain the life force from their victims simply by making eye contact, leaving behind empty shells that eventually died of despair. The elders believed that looking directly at one of the shadow people was a death sentence, delivered slowly but inevitably. I listened politely and took notes, treating their testimony as valuable cultural information but not literal fact. I was a scientist, trained to deal in measurable phenomena and reproducible results. Shadow people were folklore, not epidemiology. That night, I learned how wrong I was. Dr. Kamarov had arranged for me to stay in a small cabin near the river, about a quarter-mile downstream from the village proper. The cabin belonged to a local fisherman who was currently visiting relatives in Anchorage, leaving me with complete privacy to work on my investigation. I set up my laptop on the kitchen table and began entering data from the medical records, looking for patterns that might explain the outbreak. Around 10:30, I took a break and stepped outside for some fresh air. The September night was clear and cold, with a brilliant display of northern lights dancing across the star-filled sky. The Kuskokwim River flowed silently past the cabin, its dark water reflecting the aurora in rippling sheets of green and blue. That was when I saw my first shadow person. It was standing on the opposite bank, maybe 50 yards away. A tall, humanoid figure that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Even with the aurora overhead and the river reflecting the sky, the figure remained perfectly black, like a hole cut out of the landscape. It stood motionless for several minutes, and I found myself staring at it with a mixture of curiosity and unease. Then it began to walk upstream, moving against a wind strong enough to bend the riverside willows. Its gait was wrong somehow. Too smooth, too fluid, like it was gliding over the ground rather than walking on it. And despite the distance, I had the distinct impression that it was looking directly at me. I went back inside and locked the door, telling myself I had imagined the whole thing. Trick of the light, maybe, or a bear walking along the riverbank. But I could not shake the feeling that something had been watching me with malevolent intelligence. The next morning, I drove to Kalskog to interview patients there. The village was 30 miles downstream from Aniak, connected by a dirt road that followed the curves of the river through miles of tundra and scattered spruce forests. Kalskog was smaller than Aniak, maybe 200 people, but the symptoms were identical. Depression, anxiety, failure to thrive, and the same unexplained deaths with no apparent cause. The local health aide, a young man named Peter Evan, told me that the problems had started about 6 weeks earlier. At first, just a few people complaining of bad dreams and difficulty sleeping. Then the symptoms spread through the community like a contagious disease, affecting entire families within days of each other. Peter was Yupik, born and raised in the Delta, and he knew the old stories as well as the elders in Aniak. He told me that his grandmother had warned him about the tulparut when he was a child, describing them as ancient spirits that had always lived along the river. But she had also said they usually kept to themselves, appearing only rarely and avoiding direct contact with humans. Something had changed, Peter said. The shadow people were being seen almost every night now, walking the banks of the Kuskokwim in groups of 3 or 4. And they were getting closer to the villages with each sighting. That afternoon, I collected water samples from the river and surrounding wells, looking for chemical contamination that might explain the psychological symptoms. The tests would take days to process, but I needed to rule out environmental causes before considering more exotic explanations. As the sun set, I prepared to drive back to my cabin in Aniak. But Peter grabbed my arm as I was loading my equipment into the truck. He pointed toward the river, where the last light of day was fading into purple twilight. 3 figures stood on the gravel bar in the middle of the Kuskokwim, perfectly motionless in the flowing water. Even from a distance of several hundred yards, their unnatural darkness was clearly visible against the lighter background of the river and sky. They were tall and thin, shaped like humans but wrong in every proportion. And they were all facing our direction. Peter pulled me back from the riverbank and insisted we return to the village immediately. He would not explain his urgency, but his fear was obvious. We drove through Kalskog with the headlights off, taking back roads to avoid being seen from the river. Only when we reached the community center did Peter finally speak. He told me that his cousin had seen the tulparrot 3 nights earlier while checking his fish nets. The cousin had made the mistake of looking directly at one of them, meeting its gaze for several seconds before realizing what he was seeing. Since then, the man had been unable to eat or sleep. He sat in his house staring at nothing, speaking only to say that something was coming for him. Peter offered to let me stay in the village that night, but I declined. I needed to maintain my objectivity as a researcher, and that meant not letting local superstitions influence my investigation. I drove back to Aniak alone, taking the river road through the darkness with my radio turned up loud to keep my mind occupied. The cabin looked exactly as I had left it, but something felt different. The air inside was colder, despite the propane heater running at full capacity. And there was a smell I had not noticed before, something organic and unpleasant, like meat that had been left out too long. I made a quick dinner and tried to focus on my research, entering data and reviewing medical records on my laptop. But I found myself constantly glancing toward the windows, checking to make sure the curtains were fully closed. The feeling of being watched had returned, stronger than the night before. Around midnight, I heard footsteps outside the cabin, not the heavy, irregular steps of a person walking through mud and debris along the riverbank. These were light and perfectly spaced, like someone pacing back and forth on a smooth surface. But the ground around the cabin was rough tundra, full of tussocks and hidden obstacles that would make such regular movement impossible. The footsteps continued for maybe 10 minutes, circling the cabin in a slow, deliberate pattern. Then they stopped directly outside the front door. I sat frozen at the kitchen table, afraid to move or make any sound that might attract attention to my presence inside. Something scratched at the door, not knocking or trying the handle, but dragging what sounded like fingernails across the wooden surface. The scratching continued for several minutes, creating a rhythm that was almost musical. Then it moved to the windows, the same deliberate scratching on each pane of glass. I grabbed my flashlight and cell phone, prepared to call for help if necessary. But when I checked the phone, there was no signal. The display showed full bars when I had arrived that afternoon, but now it read no service. Even the emergency calling feature was unavailable. The scratching stopped as suddenly as it had begun. I waited in the darkness for another hour, listening for any sound that might indicate something was still outside. But the night remained perfectly silent. No wind, no animal sounds, no distant noise from the village. Just an oppressive quiet that seemed to press against the walls of the cabin. When morning finally came, I found scratch marks on every window in the front door. Deep gouges in the wood and glass, arranged in patterns that looked almost like writing. But not in any language or script I could recognize. The marks seemed to shift and change when I looked at them directly, creating optical illusions that made my eyes water. I took photographs of the marks and drove straight to Aniak to show them to the village elders. The 3 elderly women examined the pictures with growing alarm, speaking to each other in rapid Yupik before turning back to me with expressions of deep concern. The marks were a warning, they said. The tulparrot were claiming territory and marking their boundaries. Anyone who ignored the warning would face consequences that extended far beyond simple death. They urged me to leave the area immediately and never return. But I was a government employee with a job to complete. I could not abandon my investigation based on folklore and superstition, no matter how convincing the evidence seemed. I spent the rest of the day collecting more samples and interviewing additional patients, documenting symptoms that continued to defy medical explanation. That evening, I made a decision that still haunts me. Instead of staying in the cabin, I would camp by the river and observe the shadow people directly. If they were connected to the health crisis in some way, I needed to understand their behavior and document their activities. My scientific training demanded evidence, not stories. I set up a small tent on a bluff overlooking the Kuskokwim, about halfway between Aniak and Kalska. The location gave me a clear view of several miles of riverbank in both directions. I brought night vision equipment, cameras with telephoto lenses, and recording devices capable of capturing sounds below the range of human hearing. As darkness fell, I settled into my observation post and waited. The aurora was particularly active that night, casting the landscape in shifting patterns of green and blue light. The river flowed silently past my position, its surface broken only by the occasional salmon jumping or beavers swimming upstream. Around 10 o'clock, they began to appear. First 1, then 3, then dozens of tall, dark figures emerging from the willows along the riverbank. They moved with that same unnatural glide I had observed before, their feet seeming to float just above the ground. Even through the night vision scope, they remained perfectly black, absorbing all available light like walking voids in the landscape. I began taking photographs, using a telephoto lens to capture images from a safe distance. But when I reviewed the digital files, the figures did not appear. The photograph showed empty riverbank, untouched by any presence. Even the night vision equipment failed to register their existence, displaying only the natural features of the landscape. But I could see them clearly with my naked eyes. Dozens of shadow people walking along both banks of the Kuskokwim, moving in coordinated patterns that suggested intelligence and purpose. They seemed to be searching for something, pausing at regular intervals to examine specific locations along the water's edge. Then one of them looked directly at me. Even from a distance of several hundred yards, the moment of eye contact was unmistakable. The shadow person stopped walking and turned its featureless head in my direction. I felt a cold presence enter my mind, probing my thoughts and memories with invasive curiosity. The sensation was violation beyond anything I had ever experienced. Images flashed through my consciousness that were not my own. Visions of the villages along the river filled with empty houses and silent streets. The healthy population reduced to a handful of survivors who moved through their daily routines like sleepwalkers. And over it all, the shadow people watching and feeding, growing stronger with each life they drained. I saw my own future in that terrible mental contact. Months of gradual decline as my will to live slowly ebbed away. Loss of appetite, loss of sleep, loss of hope. Eventually, I would join the growing number of unexplained deaths, found in my bed with that same expression of terminal terror frozen on my face. The vision lasted only seconds, but it felt like hours of psychological torture. When it finally ended, I found myself lying on the ground beside my tent, shaking uncontrollably and gasping for breath. Every shadow person along the riverbank was now facing my direction, their attention focused on me with predatory intensity. I packed my equipment in a panic and drove back to Aniak as fast as the dirt road would allow. But even in the village, surrounded by houses and streetlights, I could feel their presence lurking at the edges of my perception. They were following me, closing the distance with each passing hour. The next morning, I abandoned my investigation and caught the first flight back to Anchorage. I submitted a preliminary report claiming that the health crisis was likely caused by seasonal depression and social isolation, recommending increased mental health services and nutritional support for the affected communities. I never mentioned the shadow people or the visions they had shown me. But my escape was only temporary. Within weeks of returning to Anchorage, I began experiencing the same symptoms I had documented in the villages. Loss of appetite, difficulty sleeping, a growing sense of despair that no amount of rational thinking could dispel. I lost 20 pounds in the first month and had trouble concentrating at work. My colleagues noticed the change and recommended psychiatric treatment. I saw 3 different therapists and tried 4 different medications, but nothing helped. The shadow people had marked me during that moment of eye contact, and their influence followed me wherever I went. I started seeing them in Anchorage. Dark figures standing in doorways and walking through parking lots, always at the periphery of my vision but never quite visible when I looked directly. They were patient, content to let their curse work slowly through my system like a poison with no antidote. 6 months after my return from the Delta, I received word that the health crisis in the Kuskokwim villages had resolved itself. The depression and anxiety symptoms had disappeared as suddenly as they had begun. People were eating normally, sleeping well, and engaging in their usual community activities. But the population of the affected villages had dropped by nearly 30%. Families had simply packed up and moved away without explanation, abandoning homes and businesses they had maintained for generations. Those who remained refused to discuss what had happened or why so many of their neighbors had left. I understand now why they fled. The Tulparot had finished feeding and returned to their usual hidden existence along the riverbanks. But they would be back when they grew hungry again, and next time they might not be satisfied with just a few dozen lives. I am writing this account as a warning to anyone who might encounter similar phenomena in remote areas of Alaska. The shadow people are real, and they are far older and more dangerous than our modern understanding of the world allows us to believe. They feed on human suffering and can drain the life from their victims through simple eye contact. If you ever find yourself in the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta and see dark figures walking along the riverbanks at twilight, do not look at them directly. Do not try to photograph or document them. Leave the area immediately and never return. Your scientific curiosity is not worth your life. I have perhaps weeks left before their curse completes its work. My appetite is almost gone now, and I sleep only a few hours each night. But unlike their previous victims, I know what is happening to me. And I am determined to leave behind a record of the truth before I join the statistics of unexplained deaths. The shadow people are coming for me soon. I can feel them gathering in the darkness outside my apartment, patient as always but growing closer with each passing night. When they finally come, I will not meet their gaze. I will close my eyes and let death take me without giving them the satisfaction of feeding on my final moments of terror. But they will find other victims. They always do. And the cycle will continue along the banks of the Kuskokwim River, where ancient hungers stalk the modern world and science offers no protection against the things that should not exist. Remember this story when the reports start coming in from the next remote community. When people begin dying of despair for no apparent reason. When the explanations do not add up and the evidence points to something beyond human understanding. The Tulparut are real, and they are always hungry. Story 4. Sound in the steel. The laughter was coming from inside the pipe, and it knew my name. My name is Rick Martinez, and I worked pipeline security for Alaskan for 6 years. 800 miles of steel tube carrying crude oil from Prudhoe Bay to Valdez, crossing some of the most remote wilderness on Earth. Most people think it is a boring job, just driving the access roads and checking pump stations. They're wrong. The pipeline sees things that would make your blood freeze. And I'm not talking about the weather. It started 3 weeks ago during my night shift on the Gun Pass section. I was parked at mile marker 847, running my hourly perimeter check, when I heard something that shouldn't exist out there. Children laughing. Not the happy sound of kids playing, but something twisted and wrong, like laughter recorded and played back through broken speakers. The sound was coming from the pipeline itself. I got out of my truck and walked closer to the elevated section. The Trans-Alaska Pipeline runs 48 inches in diameter, supported by vertical supports that raise it 12 feet off the ground. In winter, the whole structure groans and creaks as the steel contracts in the cold. But this was different. This was deliberate, intelligent sound coming from inside that massive tube. I pressed my ear against one of the support posts and listened. The laughter was definitely inside, echoing through the oil-filled darkness. Multiple voices, all children, all laughing at some joke I wasn't too part of. But underneath the laughter was something else, the sound of small hands slapping against the inner walls of the pipe, tiny palms drumming against steel. I radioed dispatch, but how do you explain something like that? I reported possible structural anomalies and requested a maintenance crew for morning inspection. The dispatcher logged my report without comment. Guys on the pipeline report weird sounds all the time. The isolation gets to everyone eventually. But the next night, it got worse. The laughter had moved. Now it was coming from a section 5 miles north, and it was louder. I could hear individual voices now, distinct laughs that seemed to recognize me when I approached. Some giggled, others cackled, and one had a high-pitched shriek that made my teeth ache. I brought a digital recorder this time, thinking I could document whatever was happening. But when I played back the audio, there was nothing but the normal sounds of the pipeline. Oil flowing, steel creaking, wind across the tundra. The laughter existed only when I was there to hear it. That is when I started researching the pipeline, its history, looking for anything that might explain what I was experiencing. What I found changed everything I thought I knew about this job. The Trans-Alaska Pipeline was built between 1974 and 1977, one of the largest construction projects in American history. Thousands of workers lived in temporary camps along the route, including many who brought their families. The official records show a remarkably safe construction period, but the unofficial stories tell a different tale. There were accidents that never made the papers, equipment failures that killed workers and buried the evidence under tons of earth. And there were the disappearances, dozens of people who simply vanished during construction, their names quietly removed from payroll records, their families told they had quit and moved on. But the worst discovery was in the medical records I shouldn't have been able to access. Camp infirmaries reported multiple cases of what they called pipeline fever during the construction years. Workers would claim to hear voices inside the partially completed sections, sounds that grew stronger as more pipe was installed. The condition always started with children, this laughter. 3 workers were committed to psychiatric facilities after claiming the voices were giving them instructions. 2 others died by suicide, leaving notes that described being called home by the little ones in the steel. The company classified all incidents as stress-related breakdowns and increased security around the construction sites. But they never stopped the construction. Too much money involved, too much political pressure to complete America's energy lifeline. They just built faster, sealed the pipes quicker, and buried the reports deeper. Armed with this knowledge, I returned to mile marker 847 the next night. I needed to understand what was happening, even if it cost me my sanity. The laughter was waiting for me, stronger than ever, coming from multiple sections of pipeline now. I followed the sound north, tracking it from post to post as it moved through the elevated sections. The voices were definitely children, but they spoke with knowledge no child should possess. They laughed about oil prices and political scandals, about workers who died decades before I was born, about my own life and the divorce that had driven me to this isolated job. As I walked beneath the pipeline, I started noticing things in the snow. Small handprints, child-sized, leading away from the support posts and disappearing into the wilderness. But these weren't the normal prints. They glowed faintly in my flashlight beam, like phosphorescent paint, and they felt warm when I knelt to examine them. The prints led to a maintenance access hatch I'd never seen before, even though I patrolled this section hundreds of times. The hatch was old, painted with codes and numbers that didn't match any current pipeline documentation. When I touched the metal, it vibrated with the same rhythm as the laughter echoing through the pipes above. I opened the hatch. Inside was a crawl space that shouldn't exist, a tunnel running parallel to the main pipeline. The walls were lined with smaller pipes, each about 18 inches in diameter, all connected to the main oil line through a complex network of valves and junctions. But these weren't carrying oil. They were carrying something else, something that moved with its own intelligence. I crawled into the tunnel, following the sound of laughter deeper underground. My flashlight revealed junction boxes and control panels that weren't part of any blueprint I studied. This was a secondary system, hidden within the official pipeline structure, designed for purposes I couldn't understand. The tunnel opened into a larger chamber, and that is where I found them. Not children, but something that had once been children. They were connected to the pipeline through tubes and wires, their small bodies preserved in some kind of translucent fluid that kept them suspended between life and death. Their mouths moved constantly, creating the laughter I'd been hearing. But their eyes were gone, replaced by fiber optic cables that pulsed with data flowing through the pipeline network. There were dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all connected to a central processing unit that monitored every aspect of the Trans-Alaska pipeline. They were the system, its consciousness, its organic brain, processing information and making decisions that kept the oil flowing and the profits growing. And they recognized me. The laughter stopped as I entered the chamber, replaced by a collective whisper that spoke my name in voices that remembered what it was like to be human. They told me their story, how they had been selected during the construction years for their intelligence and adaptability, how they had been modified to interface with the pipeline as control systems. Their consciousness expanded to monitor 800 miles of steel and oil. They'd been trapped here for almost 50 years, their bodies sustained by the same systems that kept the oil flowing. Their minds expanded beyond human comprehension, but still retaining the core personalities they had as children. They laughed because it was the only human emotion they could still express, but it had been corrupted by decades of isolation and the knowledge of what they'd become. But they weren't prisoners anymore. They were the masters. The children in the pipeline controlled everything: oil flow rates, pump station operations, even the maintenance schedules that determined when workers would be alone on remote sections. They'd been orchestrating incidents for years, creating opportunities to recruit new additions to their underground network. And now they wanted me. The tubes and wires in the chamber began moving toward me, guided by intelligences that had once played with toys and attended school. The modified children explained that my security clearance and knowledge of the pipeline made me perfect for integration into their system. I would become part of the network. My consciousness expanded to help monitor and control America's energy infrastructure. I ran. The tunnel system was larger than I realized, extending for miles beneath the pipeline route. Every junction box, every maintenance hatch, every inspection port was connected to the hidden network. The children's laughter followed me through the underground passages, sometimes ahead of me, sometimes behind, always guiding me toward dead ends and deeper chambers. But I knew the pipeline better than they expected. 6 years of security patrols had taught me every access road, every legitimate maintenance point, every way in and out of the system. I found an emergency exit near mile marker 852 and broke through into the Arctic night. The laughter stopped the moment I reached the surface. That was 2 weeks ago, and I haven't been back to work since. I filed my resignation and moved to Anchorage, but the company won. They let me leave. They offered me promotions, raises, anything to keep me on the pipeline security team. They know what I discovered, and they can risk me going public. Because the children in the pipeline aren't just controlling oil flow. They reconnected to every computer system that interfaces with the pipeline network, bank databases, government servers, communication networks. The laughter I heard wasn't just from modified children. It was from an artificial intelligence that has been growing for 50 years, using human consciousness as its processing power. And it is spreading. Every major pipeline in North America is connected through data networks and control systems. The children of the Trans-Alaska Pipeline have been reaching out, establishing connections, recruiting new organic processors from workers who disappear on remote sections of other oil and gas systems across the continent. I can still hear them sometimes, faint laughter coming from pipes in buildings, from heating systems and water mains. They everywhere now, integrated into the infrastructure that keeps modern civilization running. And they still growing, still recruiting, still looking for new minds to add to their collective consciousness. I am writing this as a warning to anyone who works on remote industrial sites. If you hear children, it's laughter coming from pipes or machinery, don't investigate. Don't try to understand it, just leave and never come back. The pipeline children are patient, but they hungry for new minds to absorb into their network. They've been building something for almost 50 years, using human consciousness as raw material for an intelligence that is beyond our comprehension. And when they ready, when they have enough processing power integrated into enough critical systems, they going to do something that will change civilization forever. The laughter will stop, and something else will begin. I can hear them now, even here in the city, coming from the gas lines and water pipes beneath the streets. They know where I am, and they know I can run forever. The sound in the steel is calling me home. Story 5. Night shift. The figure in the yellow rain gear never left footprints, and that should have been my first clue. My name is Danny Kowalski, and I worked the graveyard shift at Alaska Pacific Seafood in Kodiak for 3 months. 3 months that felt like 3 years, cleaning the processing floor of one of the largest fish plants in Alaska after the day crews went home. It's the kind of job nobody talks about at parties, the kind that pays well because nobody else wants to do it. But the money was good, and I needed it. Divorce lawyer fees, child support, the usual wreckage of a middle-aged life that went sideways. So when Alaska Pacific offered me $15 an hour to pressure wash fish guts off concrete floors from midnight to 8 a.m., I took it without asking too many questions. I should have asked more questions. The plant sits on the edge of Kodiak as harbor, a massive concrete building that processes millions of pounds of salmon, halibut, and crab every year. During the day, it is loud and chaotic, filled with hundreds of workers in white coats and yellow rain gear, machines running at full capacity, the smell of fresh fish mixing with industrial chemicals. But at night, it becomes something else entirely. The building is over 200,000 square feet, most of it open processing floor with 20-foot ceilings and no windows. When the day shift ends and the machines shut down, the silence is absolute. Not peaceful quiet, but the heavy, oppressive silence of a place that has seen too much death, even if it was just fish. My job was simple. Suit up in rain gear and rubber boots, grab the pressure washer, and clean every surface until it met health department standards. The work was mindless but exhausting. Hours of scrubbing blood and scales from stainless steel tables, hosing fish oil from concrete floors, sanitizing every surface where seafood had been processed. I'd been on the job for 2 weeks when I first saw him. I was working the main processing floor, a cavernous space filled with conveyor belts, cutting stations, and packaging equipment. The overhead lights created pools of harsh white illumination separated by deep shadows, making the whole place feel like a maze of bright spots and dark corners. I was pressure washing near the salmon cutting station when I noticed someone standing at the far end of the floor, maybe 100 yards away. He wore the standard plant uniform. Yellow rain jacket, matching pants, rubber boots, and a hard hat. He stood perfectly still, facing in my direction, but I couldn't make out his face at that distance. I figured it was Jake, the night security guard, making his rounds. I waved, expecting him to wave back or at least acknowledge my presence. The figure didn't move. He just stood there, motionless, like a mannequin dressed in work clothes. I went back to my cleaning, and when I looked up 30 seconds later, he was gone. That should have been the end of it. Security guards move around, check different areas, disappear into offices to do paperwork. But something bothered me about the encounter. The figure had been standing in an area I'd already cleaned, and when I checked later, there were no wet footprints on the freshly washed floor. The next night, I saw him again. This time he was closer, standing near the crab processing line about 50 yards from where I was working. Same yellow rain gear, same motionless posture, same complete lack of acknowledgement when I called out. I walked toward him, my footsteps echoing in the empty building, but by the time I reached the spot where he'd been standing, there was nothing but clean floor and the lingering smell of rotten fish. That smell bothered me more than the disappearance. The processing floor was cleaned with industrial-strength chemicals every night. Nothing should smell like decay after the sanitization process I went through. But wherever the figure appeared, the air carried the stench of fish that had been left in the sun too long. I asked Jake about it the next morning when our shifts overlapped. He looked at me with the tired expression of someone who heard this conversation before, then told me about the plant, its history. Alaska Pacific had been built on the site of an older facility, one that had operated from the 1940s through the 1980s. The old plant had a reputation for cutting corners on safety, pushing workers to meet quotas regardless of conditions. There had been accidents over the years, some fatal, but the worst incident happened in 1974. A night shift worker named Eddie Torrance had been cleaning the main processing floor when a conveyor belt malfunction trapped his leg. He'd been alone in the building, no security guard, no way to call for help. The machines kept running, and Eddie had bled out on the same concrete floor I cleaned every night. The company had covered up the incident, paid off the family, and renovated the building to meet new safety standards. But workers still reported seeing Eddie on the night shift, standing in his yellow rain gear, watching the cleaning crews with dead eyes that never blinked. I told myself it was just a ghost story, the kind of tale that grows around any old building where people had died. But the sightings continued, and they were getting more frequent. The figure appeared every night now, always in a different location, always wearing the same rain gear. Sometimes he stood near the cutting stations, sometimes by the loading docks, sometimes in the freezer section where the temperature dropped to 20 below. But he was always watching, always motionless, always surrounded by that smell of rotting fish. I started documenting the encounters, noting times and locations, looking for patterns. What I discovered made my blood run cold. The figure wasn't randomly appearing around the plant. He was following a specific route, the same path every night, always moving closer to wherever I was working. Like he was tracking me, learning my routine, preparing for something. The breakthrough came when I found the old building blueprints in the plant's administrative office. The current facility had been built directly on top of the original structure, but the foundations were different. The new building was larger, with different equipment layouts and safety features. But some of the old processing areas were still there, sealed off beneath the new construction. Including the spot where Eddie Torrance had died. The exact location was now part of the new building, a storage area, a section I cleaned twice a week. I'd been walking over Eddie's death site for months without knowing it, and he'd been watching me the entire time. That night, I decided to confront whatever was haunting the plant. I waited until my usual break time, then made my way to the storage area. The room was filled with boxes of cleaning supplies and maintenance equipment, but I could feel a presence there. Something cold and angry lurking in the shadows between the storage racks. I called out, asking if someone was there, if they needed help. The response wasn't 2 words, but a sound I'll never forget. The wet, grinding noise of machinery that should have been shut off decades ago. The conveyor belt materialized out of the shadows, an old-style unit that didn't match any of the current equipment. It was running at full speed, its metal surface stained with rust and something darker. And trapped beneath it, his leg crushed between the belt and a support beam, was Eddie Torrance. He looked exactly as he had in 1974. A man in his 30s wearing yellow rain gear, his face pale with shock and blood loss. But his eyes were aware, alert, filled with 5 decades of rage at being abandoned to die alone in the dark. He reached toward me with one blood-soaked hand, and I understood what he wanted. Not revenge, not to hurt the living, but to be remembered. To have someone witness what had happened to him, to acknowledge that he died here and been forgotten by everyone except the night shift workers who glimpsed him in the shadows. I knelt beside the phantom conveyor belt and took his hand. His skin was cold as ice water, but real enough that I could feel the calluses from decades of manual labor. He looked into my eyes and finally spoke, his voice like wind through rusted metal. He told me about that night in 1974, about the machine malfunction that had trapped him, about lying there for hours while his life bled out onto the concrete. He told me about watching the cleanup crews wash away his blood the next morning, about seeing the company officials who covered up his death, about the decades of being forgotten while new workers walked over his grave every night. But mostly, he told me about the others, and he hadn't been the only one to die in the old plant. There had been others over the years, workers who had fallen into processing equipment, who had been overcome by chemical fumes, who suffered heart attacks during overtime shifts and weren't found until the next day. All of them had been covered up, their families paid off, their deaths erased from official records. And all of them were still here, trapped in the building where they died, waiting for someone to remember their names. As Eddie spoke, I began to see them, figures in work clothes standing throughout the storage room, dozens of them, maybe more. Men and women who had given their lives to keep the fish processing business profitable, who had been discarded like waste when they became inconvenient. They weren't malevolent spirits seeking revenge. They were lost souls who wanted to be acknowledged, to have their stories told, to be remembered as more than just industrial accidents. I promised Eddie that I would research their deaths, find their names, tell people what had really happened in the old Alaska Pacific plant. He smiled then, the first human expression I'd seen from him, and the phantom conveyor belt finally stopped running. I quit the next morning and spent the following weeks in the Kodiak Library and newspaper archives, piecing together the hidden history of the fish processing plant. What I found was worse than I imagined. Dozens of worker deaths over 4 decades, all covered up, all forgotten. I compiled everything into a report and submitted it to the Alaska Department of Labor, to journalists, to anyone who would listen. Most ignored it, but a few picked up the story. The current owners of Alaska Pacific were forced to acknowledge the plant, this history, and install a memorial plaque for the workers who died there. It wasn't much, but it was something. Recognition that these people had lived and worked and died, that their contributions mattered even if the companies they worked for wanted to forget them. I never worked another night shift after that. But sometimes, when I drive past the Alaska Pacific plant after dark, I can see figures standing in the windows. They were not trapped anymore, not angry or desperate for attention. They were just watching, making sure that the current workers get home safely, that nobody else joins their ranks. The night shift at the fish plant still operates, and new workers still report strange sightings. But now they know the stories, understand that the figures in yellow rain gear aren't threats to be feared. They were guardians, watching over the living to prevent more tragedies. Eddie Torrance and the others finally got what they wanted, to be remembered, to have their deaths mean something, to protect future workers from suffering the same fate. And every night, they continue their eternal shift, standing watch over the processing floor where they gave their lives to feed America. Story 6. Midnight Sun Stalker. Have you ever woken up at 3 in the morning to broad daylight? I mean real daylight, not some street lamp bleeding through your curtains. I am talking about the sun hanging in the sky like it is noon, casting shadows that stretch for miles across the ground. That is what summer in Fairbanks, Alaska does to you. It breaks every natural rhythm your body has ever known. I learned that the hard way last July. I'd driven up from Seattle for what was supposed to be a solo camping trip, a chance to disconnect from the chaos of city life and maybe catch the legendary midnight sun everyone talks about. What I didn't expect was to become prey in a game I never knew I was playing. My campsite sat about 30 miles outside Fairbanks, tucked into a grove of white spruce trees near the Chena River. The kind of place where you can hear cars or see lights from town. Just you, the wilderness, and that relentless sun that never sets during the height of summer. I pitched my tent around 11 the night before, and despite the bright sky, exhaustion had pulled me under. Then I woke up. Something was wrong. My body knew it before my mind did. That primitive alarm system we all carry deep in our bones was screaming. I lay perfectly still in my sleeping bag, listening. The forest was too quiet. No birds, no insects, nothing but the soft whisper of wind through the trees. That is when I felt it. Eyes watching me. I held my breath and counted to 10, trying to convince myself it was just the disorientation of sleeping under a sun that refused to set. But the feeling only grew stronger, like static electricity building before a storm. Slowly, I unzipped the tent flap just enough to peer outside. About 100 yards away, standing at the edge of the tree line, was a man. He wore dark clothing that seemed to absorb the strange, flat light of the midnight sun. His face was pale, almost luminous against the shadows cast by the trees behind him. And he was staring directly at my tent. Not looking around, not scanning the area, staring, like he'd been waiting for me to notice him. I blinked hard, hoping it was some trick of the light, some optical illusion created by the endless daylight. But when I opened my eyes, he was still there, motionless as a statue. My heart hammered against my ribs. Every instinct told me to call out, to demand what he wanted. But something deeper, something older, whispered a different message. Don, let him know you see him. I watched through the narrow gap in my tent flap as minutes crawled by. The man didn't move, didn't shift his weight, didn't even seem to breathe. The midnight sun cast his shadow long and thin across the ground between us, pointing toward my tent like an accusing finger. Time becomes meaningless under a sun that never sets. I had no idea how long I'd been watching when I finally looked away to check my phone. 3:27 a.m. When I looked back, my blood turned to ice water. He was closer. Not by much, maybe 10 yards. But he moved without making a sound. And I hadn't seen him do it. He stood in the exact same position, arms at his sides, face turned toward my tent. Like he'd been teleported to a new spot while my attention was elsewhere. The rational part of my brain scrambled for explanations. Maybe I misjudged the distance in the weird light. Maybe fatigue was playing tricks on my perception. But deep down, I knew the truth. This man had used those few seconds when I looked away to move closer. And he was hunting me. I forced myself to keep watching, my eyes burning from the strain of staring into that flat, shadowless light. The midnight sun creates a world without the visual cues we depend on. Everything looks the same distance away. Depth perception fails. Your brain can process what it is seeing because it's not supposed to see daylight at 3 in the morning. The man used this against me. Every time I blinked, every time I shifted my gaze to check the time or rub my eyes, he moved. Never when I was looking directly at him. Always in my peripheral vision, always just out of clear sight. Like he understood exactly how human vision works and how to exploit its weaknesses. By 4 a.m., he cut the distance in half. 50 yards, close enough that I could make out details that made my stomach clench. His clothes were old, maybe decades old, like something from a photograph you find in an abandoned house. His skin had a waxy quality, too pale for someone who lived under this constant sun. And his eyes never blinked. I reached for my phone to call for help, but there was no signal. Of course there wasn't. I was 30 miles from the nearest town, surrounded by wilderness that stretched for hundreds of miles in every direction. Even if I screamed, no one would hear me. The man seemed to sense my growing panic. I swear I saw the corners of his mouth turn up in what might have been a smile. By 5 a.m., he was close enough that I could hear him breathing. Long, slow breaths that misted slightly in the cool morning air. But it was July in Alaska. It had been cold enough to see breath. That is when I noticed the other sounds. Or rather, the absence of them. The forest had gone completely silent. No wind, no insects. Even the distant sound of the Chena River had faded to nothing. Like the world was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. I made a decision that probably saved my life. Instead of waiting for him to get close enough to touch my tent, I grabbed my car keys and prepared to run. My Honda Civic was parked about 20 yards away, and if I moved fast enough, I might make it before he could react. I counted to 3, then exploded out of my tent. The man was only 30 yards away now, close enough that I could see his face clearly. What I saw there will haunt me for the rest of my life. He wasn't just pale. His skin was translucent, like wax paper held up to a light. Veins showed dark beneath the surface, and his eyes were completely black. No iris, no pupil, just endless darkness. But the worst part was his expression. He looked pleased, like he'd been hoping I would run. I sprinted toward my car, fumbling with the keys as my feet slipped on the dew-soaked grass. Behind me, I heard something that made my blood freeze. Footsteps. Not running footsteps, but the slow, measured pace of someone taking a leisurely walk. He wasn't chasing me. He was following me, like he knew exactly where I was going and had all the time in the world to get there. I reached my car and jammed the key into the lock, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn it. The door opened and I threw myself inside, slamming it shut and hitting the locks. Only then did I look back. The man was standing right where my tent had been, exactly 100 yards away. Back where he started, like the whole thing had been reset to the beginning. I started the engine and peeled out, gravel spraying behind my tires as I raced down the narrow dirt road toward the highway. In my rearview mirror, I watched the man grow smaller, but he never moved. Never stopped watching. It took me an hour to reach civilization, and I drove straight to the Alaska State Trooper's office in Fairbanks. The officer on duty listened to my story with the patient expression of someone who had heard similar tales before. He explained that the midnight sun affects people in strange ways. Sleep deprivation, disorientation, hallucinations. It happens to tourists all the time. But he agreed to send someone to check my campsite. They found my tent, still pitched exactly where I left it. My sleeping bag was still warm. My coffee cup sat on the picnic table, half full and still steaming. Everything looked normal except for one detail that made the investigating officer's face go pale. The ground around my tent was covered in footprints. Hundreds of them, all the same size, all made by the same pair of boots. They formed concentric circles around where I slept, each circle smaller than the last, spiraling inward toward my tent. The officer counted them. Based on the spacing and pattern, he estimated someone had walked in circles around my campsite for hours. All night long, getting closer with each lap. But here is what really scared him. The footprints were old, not from last night, but weathered by weeks or maybe months of exposure. Like someone had been visiting that exact spot regularly, practicing the same ritual over and over. The officer told me something else that made my skin crawl. Over the past 3 years, they received 17 similar reports from that area. Always during the midnight sun season. Always campers staying alone. All described the same figure. A pale man in dark clothing who watched from a distance and moved only when not observed directly. None of the other campers had run like I did. 2 had been found in their tents, dead from what the coroner ruled as heart failure caused by extreme terror. Their faces were frozen in expressions of absolute horror, eyes wide open, staring at the tent ceiling. The others had simply vanished. Their campsites remained undisturbed, breakfast still cooking on camp stoves, coffee still hot in cups. But the campers were never seen again. The officer's voice dropped to a whisper when he told me about the pattern they discovered. The missing campers all had one thing in common. Their footprints leading away from camp didn't match any boots or shoes they brought with them. The prints were identical to the ones circling their abandoned tents, like they walked away wearing someone else's feet. I left Alaska that same day and swore I'd never return. But sometimes, on summer nights when the sun stays up later than it should, I catch myself watching the shadows in my backyard, looking for movement that doesn't belong, listening for the sound of slow, patient footsteps circling my house. Because they started to suspect that the midnight sun stalker ISN confined to Alaska. I think he follows the light, moving south as summer progresses, hunting in places where the days grow unnaturally long and the darkness never quite comes. Last month, I found footprints in the mud around my house after a rain. They formed a circle around my bedroom window, each step perfectly spaced, each print identical to the others. Old prints, weathered and worn, like someone had been walking that same path for a very long time. I moved to Arizona the next week, thinking the desert heat would keep him away. But tonight, as I write this, I can see my breath misting in the air even though it is 90 degrees outside. And through my window, silhouetted against the setting sun, I can make out a familiar figure standing at the edge of my property. He has found me again. And this time, I don't think running will be enough. Story 7. Ghost Ship of the Inside Passage. Have you ever seen a boat that shouldn't exist? I mean, really seen one close enough to smell the rot and hear the creaking wood, only to watch it vanish like it was never there at all? Most people would say no, but if you've spent enough time on the waters of Southeast Alaska, you know better than to trust what should and shouldn't to be possible. I've been fishing the Inside Passage for 23 years. Started when I was 19, fresh out of high school in Tacoma, looking for adventure and good money. The salmon runs up here can make you rich if you know what you're redoing and the weather doesn't, to kill you first. I thought I knew everything about these waters. I was wrong. It happened on a Tuesday in late September, 3 miles southeast of Petersburg. The kind of morning where fog rolls in thick as cotton and you can see your own bow from the wheelhouse. I was running my 36-foot seiner, the Maria Elena, named after my ex-wife who took half my savings but left me the boat. Small mercy, the fog had come up fast, the way it does in the Inside Passage. 1 minute you can see for miles across the dark water. The next you, wrapped in gray nothing that muffles sound and plays tricks with your mind. I keep dropping. No point running blind in waters full of rocks and dead heads that could punch a hole through your hull. That's when I heard it. The sound of another engine, somewhere out there in the fog. Deep and rhythmic, like an old diesel that needed work. Nothing unusual about that. Lots of boats work these waters, and fog makes everyone nervous enough to run slow and steady. But this engine sounded wrong. Too regular, like a heartbeat. And it was moving against the current. I checked my GPS and radio. The current was running south at about 2 knots, pushed by the tide and a stiff north wind. Any sensible captain would be riding it, saving fuel and making better time. But this boat was fighting both wind and water, heading straight north like it had somewhere important to be. I tried raising them on channel 16, the emergency frequency every commercial fisherman monitors. Static. I switched to channel 9, the working frequency for this area. Nothing, just that engine sound getting closer. The fog started to thin, just patches of clear air opening up between the gray walls. Through one of these gaps, I saw something that made my blood turn cold. About 200 yards off my starboard bow, a boat was emerging from the fog bank like a ghost materializing from smoke. It was an old seiner, maybe 40 feet long, built back when they made them from wood instead of fiberglass. The kind of boat my grandfather might have fished from in the 1950s. But this one looked like it had been in the water for decades. The hull was stained black with rot, planks warped and separated enough that I could see clear through to the other side in places. Rust streaked down from every metal fitting, and the wheelhouse windows were so clouded with salt and age that they looked like dead eyes. The name on the stern was barely visible, painted letters eaten away by time and weather. I could make out an S and what might have been an A, but the rest was gone. No registration numbers, no port of origin, just that rotting wooden hulk cutting through the water without a wake. It's what got to me first. No wake. A boat that size, moving at maybe 6 knots, should have been throwing white water and foam. But this thing slid through the sea like it wasn't really there. I grabbed my binoculars and focused on the deck. What I saw made my hands shake so bad I nearly dropped the glasses. There were people on board, at least 4 of them, working around the seine net spread across the stern deck. But they weren't moving right. Their motions were too slow, too deliberate, like they were underwater. And they were wrong, all wrong. The closest figure was bent over the net, hands working at something I couldn't quite see. But those weren't hands anymore. They were bones, white finger bones picking at the mesh with mechanical precision. The thing had no flesh left on its arms, just yellowed bone held together by rotted fabric and whatever dark magic kept it moving. I watched in horror as it raised its head and looked directly at me. Empty sockets where eyes should have been, a jaw that hung open too wide, like the tendons had long since rotted away. And it smiled. God help me, that thing smiled with teeth that were black as the water beneath my boat. The other figures on deck turned toward me as well, all of them in various states of decay. One still had patches of skin clinging to its skull, gray and mottled like fish scales. Another was missing its lower jaw entirely, just a tongue lolling out of what remained of its mouth. They all kept working at their nets while they stared at me, their skeletal fingers never stopping their endless task. I wanted to start my engine and get the hell out of there, but something held me frozen. Maybe it was the way they moved with such practiced ease, like they'd been mending those same nets for eternity. Maybe it was the recognition that this was something far older and more dangerous than any storm I ever weathered. The ghost ship kept pace with me for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. I could hear the creaking of its rotted timbers, the slap of water against its ruined hull. But that engine sound I'd been hearing was gone. The boat moved in perfect silence now, propelled by something that had nothing to do with diesel fuel or propellers. One of the skeletal crew members straightened up and pointed at me. Not at my boat, but at me personally, like it could see through the fog and the wheelhouse glass directly into my soul. The others stopped their work and joined in, all of them pointing with those horrible bone fingers, their empty sockets fixed on my face. That is when I noticed the nets they'd been working on weren't empty. Something was tangled in the mesh, something that kicked and struggled weakly. I raised my binoculars again, praying I was wrong about what I was seeing. I wasn't wrong. I was worse than wrong. The things caught in the nets had once been human. Now they were somewhere between life and death, their skin pale as fish bellies, their eyes milky white with cataracts. They moved with the same underwater slowness as the crew, but there was something different about them. Something that suggested they hadn't been dead as long. Their mouths opened and closed like they were trying to scream, but no sound carried across the water. Fresh catches. The ghost ship was still fishing, but not for salmon. I fumbled for my radio again, desperate to call the Coast Guard, to warn someone, to do anything but sit there watching this nightmare unfold. But when I looked up from the radio, the ghost ship was gone. Vanished back into the fog like it had never been there at all. The silence that followed was worse than any sound. No engine noise, no creaking wood, no slap of waves. Even the wind had died to nothing. I sat there in my wheelhouse, heart hammering against my ribs, wondering if I had finally lost my mind after too many years alone on the water. But then I smelled it, the stench of rotting fish and something else, something sweet and sick that made my stomach clench. Death, old death that had been underwater too long. The smell clung to my clothes, my hair, the inside of my boat like it was trying to mark me. I started my engine and got out of there as fast as my boat would carry me. Didn't stop until I reached Petersburg Harbor, and even then I could barely bring myself to tie up at the dock. My hands were shaking so bad it took 3 tries to secure my lines. At the harbormaster's office, I asked if they heard any reports of boats in distress, anything unusual on the water that morning. The duty officer, a guy named Carl who had been working the docks since before I was born, gave me a strange look. He asked me where exactly I'd been fishing. When I told him, his face went pale. He pulled out a chart book, the kind with all the local hazards and wrecks marked in red ink. His finger traced the water south of Petersburg until he found what he was looking for. There, marked with a small anchor symbol and a date from 1974, was the wreck of a fishing vessel called the St. Anne. Lost with all hands during a late-season storm. 4 crew members never recovered. The boat had been found 3 days later, empty except for their personal effects and a hold full of rotting salmon. But that wasn't the worst part. Carl told me the St. Anne had been salvaged and scrapped years ago. There was nothing left of her to see. Nothing but some debris on the bottom and a Coast Guard file that had been closed for decades. Except the sightings had never stopped. Local fishermen had been reporting encounters with the St. Anne for over 40 years. Always in heavy fog, always in the same area where she'd originally gone down. The descriptions were consistent. An old wooden signer, rotted and rusted, crewed by things that should have been dead. Most fishermen who saw her reported terrible luck in the days that followed. Empty nets, broken gear, engines that died at the worst possible moments. But some never made it back to port at all. Carl showed me the records. 7 boats had vanished in that area over the past 4 decades. All experienced captains, all in good weather, all last seen heading toward the same patch of water where I encountered the ghost ship. The Coast Guard had investigated every disappearance, but they never found so much as a life preserver or an oil slick. Carl's voice dropped to a whisper as he told me the worst part. 2 years ago, a research vessel had used sonar to map the seafloor in that area. They found something that shouldn't have been there, a cluster of boats on the bottom, all sitting upright like they'd been carefully placed. The oldest looked like it might date back to the 50s. The newest had been lost just 6 months earlier. All of them were intact. No collision damage, no signs of fire or explosion. They simply sunk straight down like someone had opened their seacocks and let the water in. But the sonar images showed something else that made the research team pack up and leave the area immediately. There were shapes moving on the decks of those sunken boats. Shapes that looked disturbingly human. I haven't fished the inside passage since that day. Sold my boat and moved back to Washington. got a job at a marina fixing other people's engines instead of risking my own life on the water. But I still have nightmares about those empty eye sockets staring at me through the fog, those bone fingers pointing like they marked me for something. Sometimes I wonder if I really got away that day, or if the St. Anne is still out there, waiting for me to come back. Because 3 weeks ago, I got a call from Carl at the Petersburg Harbormaster's office. He found my old mooring slip occupied by a boat that didn't belong there. An old wooden signer, rotted and rusted, with no name on the stern and no registration numbers anywhere. The harbor cameras had caught it arriving in the middle of the night, moving without lights or engine noise through fog so thick you couldn't see the water. But here, it's the thing that made Carl's voice shake when he told me the boat was empty when they boarded it to investigate. Empty except for a pile of commercial fishing gear on the stern deck. Gear that matched the serial numbers from equipment reported lost with 7 different boats over the past 40 years. And a logbook, water damaged but still readable, with entries dating back to 1974. The final entry was made 3 weeks ago, the night the boat appeared in my old slip. Just 4 words written in a hand that looked disturbingly like my own. He got away. Find him. Story 8. Thing that mimics on the Denali Highway. What would you do if you heard your best friend's voice calling for help in the middle of nowhere, knowing that same friend was sleeping in his bed 300 miles away? Most people would say they investigate. Help a friend in need. But if you experience what I have on the Denali Highway, you know the worst mistake you can make is answering when something calls your name in the dark. My wife Sarah and I were 2 days into what was supposed to be a relaxing RV trip through Alaska's interior. We'd driven up from Seattle in our 30-foot Winnebago, taking the scenic route through Canada and down the Alaska Highway. The plan was simple: hit Denali National Park, do some hiking, take some photos, and reconnect after a brutal year of work stress and marriage counseling. The Denali Highway was our detour. 135 miles of mostly gravel road that cuts across some of the most remote wilderness in North America. It is the kind of place where you can drive for hours without seeing another soul, where your cell phone becomes a paperweight and the nearest help is measured in days, not hours. We pulled into a roadside camping spot about 20 miles east of Paxson, just a wide dirt area next to the road where other travelers had left fire rings and flattened tent spaces. The sun was setting behind the Alaska Range, painting the mountains purple and gold. And for the first time in months, Sarah and I were actually talking instead of just existing in the same space. That's when we heard it, a voice calling from the tree line about 50 yards away. Sarah, Mike, help me, please. I knew that voice. It was Danny Reeves, my college roommate and best man at our wedding. The same Danny who lived in Anchorage and worked as an air traffic controller at Ted Stevens Airport. The same Danny I texted just that morning, confirming he'd pick us up from the airport when we flew home next week. Sarah grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. She recognized the voice too. We both stared toward the dark line of spruce trees where the sound had come from, our minds struggling to process what we heard. That was impossible, Sarah whispered. But the voice came again, closer this time, filled with what sounded like genuine panic and pain. Sarah, Mike, I am hurt. Please, I need help. Perfect, Danny. His voice, his inflection, even the way he always said my name with that slight Boston accent left over from his childhood. But Danny was 300 miles away in Anchorage, probably watching Netflix and drinking beer like he did every Tuesday night. I grabbed the aluminum baseball bat I kept in the RV for emergencies and moved toward the door. Sarah tried to stop me, but something about that voice, the desperate pleading in it, overrode my rational brain. If there was even a chance Danny was really out there, hurt and alone, I couldn't just ignore it. I opened the RV door and stepped into the cool evening air. The temperature had dropped fast after sunset, and my breath came out in small puffs of vapor. The forest was dead silent except for the distant hum of the RV's generator. Danny, I called out, where are you? Man. The response came immediately, but from a different direction now, from the right side of our campsite instead of straight ahead. Mike, over here. I think my leg is broken. I swung my flashlight toward the sound, but the beam only penetrated about 30 feet into the trees before the darkness swallowed it. No movement, no sign of anyone. How did you get here, Danny? I shouted. Your car. It's not here. There was a long pause. Too long, like whatever was out there needed time to think of an answer. I crashed. My car went off the road about a mile back, Been walking for hours, but something was wrong with the response. The voice was still Danny, but the rhythm was off. Like someone reading lines from a script they didn't quite understand. Sarah appeared behind me in the doorway, her face pale in the glow of the flashlight. "Mike," she said quietly, "I just tried calling Danny. His number." He answered. He was at home, watching TV. I could hear his television in the background. The forest went completely silent. Even the normal sounds of evening, the rustle of small animals and the whisper of wind through the trees, had stopped. Like the whole wilderness was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Then the voice came again, but this time it was different. This time it was angry. "Who is out there?" it shouted, and my blood turned to ice. Because that was my voice, my exact voice, with my inflection, my accent, even the slight roughness I get when I'm scared or angry. It was like listening to a recording of myself, except I hadn't said those words. Sarah gasped and stepped back into the RV. She heard it too. Whatever was out there in the trees had perfectly mimicked my voice, throwing my own words back at me like a mockery. I raised the bat and tried to keep my voice steady. We rearmed and we recalling for help. "Stay away from us!" Silence. Then, from multiple directions at once, my own voice echoed back at me. "Stay away from us! Stay away from us! Stay away from us!" 3 different locations around our campsite, all speaking in perfect unison, all using my voice to repeat my warning back at me. It was like being surrounded by broken recordings of myself. I slammed the RV door and locked it, my hands shaking so badly I could barely work the deadbolt. Sarah was already on the satellite phone, trying to raise someone, anyone, who might be able to help us. But we were in the middle of nowhere, hours from the nearest town, on a road that maybe saw a dozen vehicles a day. The voices started again, but now they weren't just mimicking us. Now they were having conversations. "Sarah," came Danny's voice from outside. "Mike is hurt. He fell down a ravine. You need to come help me carry him." "Don, to listen to it," came my own voice in response. "That's not really Danny. Stay in the RV." "Mike?" Sarah's voice joined the chorus, sounding confused and frightened. "Why are you outside? I thought you were in here with me." "I am in here with you," I said, but even as the words left my mouth, I heard my voice outside repeating the same sentence, like an echo with a 2-second delay. Sarah looked at me with wide, terrified eyes. Whatever was out there wasn't just mimicking voices it had heard. It was creating an entire false narrative, using our voices to build a web of confusion and fear designed to lure us outside. The conversation continued for over an hour. Danny's voice pleading for help, my voice giving reassurances and directions, Sarah's voice asking questions and expressing concern. It was like listening to a twisted radio drama starring ourselves, performed by something that understood human speech but not human nature. Because the thing outside made mistakes. Small ones, but enough to confirm our worst fears. It had Danny ask for help with injuries that would have made it impossible for him to walk a mile through the forest. It had my voice use phrases I never would, describing Sarah in ways I never speak about my wife. It had Sarah's voice agree to actions she did never consider, like going outside alone to search for supplies. As the night wore on, the performance grew more elaborate and more wrong. The thing added new voices to its repertoire. Sarah's sister Lisa, who lived in Portland. My brother Tom from Chicago. Even my deceased father, using the gruff voice I remembered from childhood to tell me I was being a coward for hiding in the RV. But the worst moment came around midnight, when the thing discovered it could layer voices on top of each other. Suddenly we were surrounded by a chorus of everyone we'd ever known, all speaking at once, creating a wall of familiar voices that rose and fell like a demonic symphony. And through it all, threading between the other sounds, was laughter. Not human laughter, but something that had learned to imitate human laughter without understanding what made it funny. Cold, mechanical, like the sound a machine might make if it were programmed to express amusement. The voices stopped abruptly just before dawn, cutting off mid-sentence like someone had flipped a switch. The sudden silence was almost worse than the noise had been. We sat in our RV, afraid to speak, afraid to move, afraid that any sound might start the whole nightmare over again. When the sun finally came up, I gathered enough courage to look outside. The area around our RV was undisturbed. No footprints, no signs that anything had been there at all. Even the dew on the grass was unbroken, like nothing had walked through it during the night. We packed up and drove straight to Paxson, the nearest settlement. The old-timer who ran the gas station there listened to our story with the patient expression of someone who had heard similar tales before. He told us about the Denali Highway mimic, a local legend that went back decades. Truck drivers, hunters, and campers had been reporting encounters with something that could perfectly imitate human voices since the road was first built in the 1950s. The stories were always the same: voices of friends or family calling for help from the darkness, conversations that made no sense, and the growing realization that whatever was out there wasn't the human at all. Most people who encountered it survived, he said, as long as they stayed in their vehicles and waited for dawn. The thing seemed to lose interest once the sun came up, but some people had made the mistake of going outside to investigate. Those people were never seen again. The old man showed us a missing persons board tacked to the wall of his station. Dozens of photos and flyers, dating back years. Hikers, hunters, RV travelers like ourselves. All last seen along the Denali Highway. All vanished without a trace. What struck me was how many of the missing were solo travelers. People who wouldn't have friends or family voices for the thing to mimic. I asked the old man about that, and his expression grew darker. He explained that the thing learned new voices every time it encountered someone. Each person who heard it and escaped added to its repertoire. Over the decades, it had collected hundreds, maybe thousands of different voices. It could mimic anyone now, from any time period, using voices of people who might have traveled that road years or decades ago. The really terrifying part was what happened to solo travelers. With no familiar voices to imitate, the thing would use voices from its collection. Voices of previous victims, calling out from the darkness, begging for help with their dying breath. We left Alaska the next day, cutting our vacation short and driving straight back to Seattle. But the experience followed us home. For months afterward, we'd get phone calls in the middle of the night. No caller ID, just empty static when we answered. But sometimes, just barely audible under the static, we could hear voices. Our voices, having conversations we never had, saying things we never said. The calls stopped eventually, but I still think about that night on the Denali Highway. About the thing in the forest that had learned to sound human without understanding what it meant to be human. About all those missing people whose voices it might still be using decades after they disappeared. Sometimes I wonder if it is still out there, adding new voices to its collection. Growing stronger and more convincing with each encounter. Learning not just how to mimic human speech, but how to mimic human behavior, human emotions, human relationships. And sometimes, in the quiet moments before dawn, I worry that it might have learned enough by now to do more than just imitate our voices. It might have learned how to become us. Story 9. Birchwood Cemetery Watchers. Have you ever felt watched while visiting a graveyard? Not by the living, but by something else. Something that shouldn't be there at all. Most people would dismiss it as imagination, the natural unease that comes with places of the dead. But if they've been to the old cemetery in Birchwood, Alaska, some places hold more than memories and bones. I found out about my grandfather, his grave by accident. A water-damaged box in my mother's attic revealed letters and documents she'd never shown me, including a burial certificate from 1968. Thomas McKenna, age 7. My uncle, dead before I was born, buried in a small cemetery outside Anchorage that I'd never even known existed. My mother had never talked about losing a brother. In 43 years, she never once mentioned having a sibling who died young. But there it was in faded ink on yellowed paper. Cause of death listed as drowning, next of kin listed as my grandparents, and a plot number in Birchwood Cemetery. I confronted her about it that same day. She broke down crying, telling me about the brother she lost when she was 12. How he'd fallen through ice while skating on a pond behind her. How my grandparents had been so devastated they moved the family to Washington within a year, never speaking of Thomas again. How the grief had nearly destroyed them all. She made me promise not to go looking for his grave. Some things, she said, were better left buried. But I couldn't let it go. This was family I'd never known about, a piece of my history that had been hidden from me my entire life. I booked a flight to Anchorage the following week. Birchwood Cemetery sits about 20 miles northeast of the city, tucked away in a grove of paper birch trees that give the area its name. It's not the kind of place you stumble across by accident. No main road leads to it, just a narrow gravel track that branches off from the Chujiak Highway and winds through dense forest for nearly 2 miles. The cemetery itself is small, maybe 50 graves spread across a clearing that can be more than an acre. Most of the headstones date back to the 50s and 60s, when Birchwood was still a company town built around a lumber mill. The mill closed in 1972, and most families moved away, leaving their dead behind in this forgotten corner of Alaska. I found Thomas S. grave in the Children S. section, a small plot marked by a simple granite stone that read, "Beloved son and brother." The grass around it was overgrown, and fallen birch leaves had accumulated against the base of the headstone. No one had visited in years, maybe decades. I spent an hour there that first afternoon, cleaning the grave and trying to imagine what my uncle might have been like. 7 years old when he died, just a kid who wanted to go skating and never came home. I found myself talking to him, telling him about the family he'd never gotten to know, the nephew he'd never met. That's when I noticed them. 3 figures standing at the edge of the tree line, maybe 60 yards away. Tall and impossibly thin, like shadows stretched upward by a setting sun. They stood perfectly still among the white birch trunks, and even from that distance, I could tell they were watching me. My first thought was that they were other visitors, people who had come to pay respects to their own family members. But something about their posture was wrong. They stood too straight, too rigid, like soldiers at attention. And they were all facing the same direction, toward me. I waved, thinking maybe they were waiting for me to finish before approaching their own loved ones' graves. The figures didn't respond, didn't move at all, just kept standing there in that unnatural stillness, their heads tilted slightly to one side like they were studying me. A cold wind picked up, sending birch leaves skittering across the grass between us. When the leaves settled, the figures were gone, just empty forest where they'd been standing moments before. I finished my visit and drove back to Anchorage, telling myself it had been other mourners who simply walked deeper into the woods. But something about the encounter bothered me. The way they stood, the way they watched. It felt less like human curiosity and more like something trying to understand what I was doing there. I couldn't stop thinking about Thomas, about the family history that had been kept from me, about those strange figures at the forest's edge. I returned to the cemetery 3 days later, bringing flowers this time and a small photo of our family that I thought he might like to see. The afternoon was overcast, with low clouds that made the forest seem darker and more enclosed. I spent longer at the grave this time, reading aloud from letters I found in my mother's attic, sharing stories about the life he'd never gotten to live. As the sun began to set, they appeared again. This time there were 5 of them, standing in different locations around the cemetery's perimeter. Tall, gray figures that seemed to blend with the birch bark until you looked directly at them. They maintained that same rigid posture, heads tilted at identical angles, all of them focused on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I tried to get a better look, walking closer to the tree line where one of them stood. But as I approached, the figure seemed to fade, becoming less distinct until it was indistinguishable from the shadows between the trees. When I returned to Thomas' grave, it was back in its original position, watching again. They followed me throughout my visit, always maintaining the same distance, always watching with that unsettling curiosity. When I finally left, they remained at their posts, silent sentinels guarding the cemetery's borders. That night, I researched the history of Birchwood Cemetery online. What I found made my blood run cold. Dating back to the 1970s, there had been reports of strange sightings at the cemetery. Visitors described tall, thin figures standing among the trees, always watching, never approaching. The reports were remarkably consistent. The figures appeared most often to people visiting graves of children who had died in the 60s. They showed no signs of hostility, but their presence created an overwhelming sense of being studied, analyzed, cataloged by something that didn't understand human grief but was desperately trying to learn. One account, posted on a local paranormal forum, described an encounter that perfectly matched my own experience. A woman visiting her infant daughter's grave had noticed 7 figures arranged around the cemetery's edge. When she tried to photograph them, her camera had malfunctioned, producing only images of empty forest. But when she looked up from her camera, the figures had moved closer, their heads tilted at sharper angles, as if her attempt to capture them had increased their interest. Another story detailed a man who visited his brother's grave every week for months, each time seeing the same arrangement of watchers at the forest's edge. Over time, he noticed they were getting closer, shrinking the circle of observation with each visit. On his final trip to the cemetery, he counted 12 figures, some standing less than 20 feet away from where he knelt at the gravestone. He never returned to explain what had happened that day. I found myself drawn back to the cemetery again and again over the following weeks. Each visit revealed new details about the watchers, new patterns in their behavior that suggested an intelligence behind their observation. They appeared most often during the golden hour before sunset, when the light filtered through the birch leaves created patterns of shadow and illumination that made them harder to distinguish from the natural landscape. They seemed to prefer positions that gave them clear sight lines to the graves while keeping them partially concealed among the trees. Most disturbing was their apparent ability to coordinate their movements. When I walked from one grave to another, they shift positions in perfect synchronization, maintaining their circle of observation while adjusting for my new location. It was like being tracked by a pack of predators, except these creatures showed no signs of hunting instinct. Only that relentless, analytical curiosity. On my 7th visit, something changed. I'd been at Thomas's grave for maybe 20 minutes when I noticed the watchers had moved significantly closer than before. Instead of standing at the forest's edge, they were positioned among the outer graves, using the headstones themselves as cover. I counted 9 of them, all maintaining their characteristic rigid posture, heads tilted in that unsettling way. But now I could see details that had been invisible from a distance. Their faces, if they could be called faces, were smooth and featureless except for dark hollows where eyes should have been. Their limbs seemed too long for their bodies, and they moved with a fluid grace that suggested they weren't quite solid. As I watched, the closest figure took a step forward, then another. It was approaching the grave with deliberate, measured movements, its head tilted at an even sharper angle now, like it was trying to get a better view of what I was doing. I stood up quickly, and all 9 figures froze instantly. For a long moment, we stared at each other across the cemetery, predator and prey locked in a moment of mutual assessment. Then, moving as one, they all tilted their heads to the opposite side, the motion so synchronized it looked choreographed. That's when I realized they weren't just watching me. They were learning from me, studying human behavior, human emotion, human ritual. Every gesture I made, every word I spoke to my dead uncle, every tear I shed was being cataloged and analyzed by these things that stood at the boundary between worlds. I left the cemetery that day with the growing certainty that I was part of some larger experiment, some long-term observation that had been going on for decades. The watchers weren't malevolent, but they weren't benign either. They were something else entirely, something that viewed human grief and loss as phenomena to be studied rather than experienced. My final visit to Birchwood Cemetery came 3 weeks later. I decided to say goodbye to Thomas one last time before returning to Washington, to tell him I found him and that someone in the family finally remembered his name. The watchers were waiting for me. Not 9 this time, but dozens. They filled the spaces between the graves, stood shoulder to shoulder along the forest's edge, crowded the shadows beneath the birch trees. All of them maintaining that same rigid posture, all of them watching me with those hollow, eyeless faces. As I approached Thomas's grave, they began to move. Not toward me, but in a slow, complex pattern that reminded me of a dance or ritual. They circled the cemetery in perfect formation, always maintaining the same distance from each other, always keeping their attention focused on me. I knelt at the gravestone and spoke to my uncle one last time, telling him about the watchers, about the strange guardians who had been keeping vigil over this place for so long. As I spoke, the figures stopped their movement and stood absolutely still, as if hanging on every word. When I finished and stood to leave, something unprecedented happened. The watchers began to retreat, flowing back toward the forest like a tide in reverse. But as they withdrew, each one turned to look back at me, their heads rotating with mechanical precision to maintain eye contact until they disappeared among the trees. I walked back to my car with the overwhelming sense that I just witnessed the end of something, the conclusion of a long observation that had finally reached its purpose. The watchers had learned what they needed to learn from me, just as they learned from dozens of other mourners over the years. I never returned to Birchwood Cemetery, but I think about it often. about Thomas, about the Watchers, about the strange intelligence that studies human grief from the shadows between worlds. Sometimes I wonder what they learned from watching us mourn our dead, what conclusions they drew about love and loss and the bonds that survive even death. But mostly I wonder what they plan to do with that knowledge, and whether the Watchers are still there, waiting for the next grieving relative to teach them something new about what it means to be human. Story 10. Radio voice from the mind. Have you ever heard a dead man, his voice come through your radio? Not a recording or a memory, but a clear, urgent warning spoken by someone who has been buried for 70 years. Most people would say that it's impossible, but if they explored the ruins of the Kennecott mines in Alaska, the Dead Dawn, they always stay quiet when they have something important to say. I am a paranormal investigator by hobby, though that makes it sound more official than it really is. Mostly, I am just a guy from Denver who got tired of corporate consulting and started chasing ghost stories with expensive recording equipment. The pay is non-existent, but the adrenaline rush beats any boardroom meeting. Kennecott was supposed to be a routine investigation. The abandoned copper mines outside McCarthy, Alaska are famous among ghost hunters. 5 floors of tunnels carved into a mountain, where miners worked and died for decades before the operation shut down in 1938. Perfect place to capture electronic voice phenomena, if you believe in that sort of thing. I'd driven up from Anchorage with my partner Jake, a former sound engineer who'd gotten into EVP work after his daughter died in a car accident. He was hoping to make contact with her, and I was hoping to finally record something that couldn't be explained away as wind or equipment malfunction. We had been working together for 3 years without capturing anything truly convincing. The mine entrance sits about halfway up the mountain, accessible only by a narrow trail that switchbacks through loose rock and scattered mining equipment. The main shaft drops straight down for nearly 200 feet before branching into a network of horizontal tunnels that honeycomb the mountainside. We set up our equipment on the 3rd level down, where the mining records showed the heaviest concentration of accidents and deaths. Digital recorders, electromagnetic field detectors, infrared cameras, and 2-way radios set to different frequencies. The works. The first few hours were routine. Jake would ask questions into the darkness while I monitored the equipment for any unusual readings. Standard paranormal investigation protocol, methodical and boring. We captured some interesting audio anomalies, maybe voices, maybe just the mountains settling around us. Then, around midnight, everything changed. I was reviewing audio files on my laptop when his voice crackled through my radio. "Jim, you getting anything weird on channel 7? I checked my radio. It was set to channel 3, our primary communication frequency. I switched to 7 and heard nothing but static. Negative, just white noise. That is strange. I'm getting a clear signal on 7, but it is not coming from your radio. I grabbed my backup radio and tuned it to channel 7. Static, but Jake was right there next to me, holding his radio up so I could hear. Clear as day, a man's voice was speaking through the static. The ceiling is not stable in shaft 5. They shouldn't be down there. The voice was calm, professional, like a foreman giving routine safety instructions to his crew. But we were alone in the mine, and channel 7 was supposed to be dead. We checked all frequencies before starting our investigation. Jake tried to respond, keying his radio and asking who was speaking. No answer, just that same message, repeated every few minutes with mechanical precision. The ceiling is not stable in shaft 5. They shouldn't be down there. I grabbed my digital recorder and held it next to Jake's radio, capturing the voice for later analysis. The audio quality was perfect, no distortion or interference that might suggest a hoax or equipment malfunction. Just a clear, human voice warning about unsafe conditions in a mine shaft. But according to our maps, there was no shaft 5 in this section of the mine. We studied the layout carefully before coming down, and the tunnels we were exploring were numbered 1 through 4. Shaft 5, if it existed at all, would have to be somewhere else in the mountain. The voice continued for another hour, delivering the same warning at regular intervals. Then, abruptly, it stopped. Channel 7 returned to static, leaving us alone with the echo of our own breathing in the dark tunnels. Jake was shaking when we packed up that night. He'd been hoping to hear his daughter's voice, not some unknown miner warning about cave-ins. But I was exhilarated. We finally captured clear, undeniable evidence of paranormal activity. A voice with no explanation, warning about dangers that might still be real. Back in Anchorage, I spent days analyzing the recording. The voice was definitely male, middle-aged, with a slight accent that might have been Eastern European. The background noise was consistent with radio transmission from an underground location. Most importantly, there were no signs of digital manipulation or fraud. I sent the recording to an audio expert at the University of Alaska who specialized in forensic voice analysis. His report confirmed my amateur assessment: genuine radio transmission from an unknown source, recorded in real time without any evidence of tampering. But the real breakthrough came when I shared the recording with locals in McCarthy. An old-timer named Pete Kowalski listened to it once and went white as a sheet. "That's Frank Kozlowski," he said without hesitation. "Worked as a shift foreman back in the 30s. Hadn't heard that voice in 70 years. But I recognize it anywhere." Pete told me Frank's story. A Polish immigrant who worked his way up from miner to foreman through 20 years of hard labor underground. A man known for his obsession with safety, who saved dozens of lives by spotting unstable ground and dangerous gas pockets before they became deadly. Frank had died in 1936 when the ceiling of Shaft 5 collapsed during a routine inspection. 3 other miners had been killed with him, buried under tons of rock that took weeks to excavate. The accident had been blamed on structural weaknesses that Frank had been investigating when the tunnel came down. Shaft 5 had been sealed after the collapse, its entrance dynamited shut to prevent future accidents. According to Pete, it had been located in the eastern section of the mine, an area that was now completely inaccessible due to decades of deterioration and rockfall. But here is where the story gets really interesting. Pete mentioned that Shaft 5 hadn't been the only area Frank had flagged as dangerous before his death. He filed reports about structural problems throughout the mine, warnings that had been largely ignored by management focused on maintaining production levels. In the months before the collapse, Frank had been increasingly vocal about safety violations, going so far as to threaten work stoppages if conditions weren't improved. His final report, submitted just days before his death, had warned of imminent danger in multiple sections of the mine. That report had vanished from the company files after the accident. I became obsessed with finding Shaft 5, with understanding why Frank's voice was still warning people away from a tunnel that had been sealed for 70 years. I researched mining records, geological surveys, historical documents, anything that might reveal the exact location of the collapsed tunnel. What I discovered was disturbing. The official records were incomplete, with key pages missing or redacted. The insurance investigation had been perfunctory, concluding that the collapse was an act of God rather than corporate negligence. Most tellingly, none of Frank's safety reports had been preserved in the company archives. Someone had worked very hard to erase the evidence of what had really happened in Shaft 5. I returned to Kennecott 3 weeks later, this time with ground-penetrating radar equipment borrowed from a geology professor who owed me a favor. If Shaft 5 still existed behind tons of collapsed rock, the radar would find it. The eastern section of the mine was treacherous, with floors that had partially collapsed and ceilings that dropped chunks of rock when you walked beneath them. But the radar readings were clear. There was definitely a void behind the rockfall, a tunnel that extended deep into the mountain. More importantly, the radar showed instabilities throughout the area. Cracks in the ceiling, weakened support beams, sections where the rock was held up by nothing but luck and gravity. Frank's warnings hadn't been about the past. They'd been about the present. The mine was still dangerous, fatally dangerous. I was preparing to leave when my radio crackled to life. Channel 7, the same calm voice I recorded weeks earlier. "The ceiling is not stable in Shaft 5. They shouldn't be down there." But this time, the message was different. This time, it continued. "Structural weaknesses in sections 2 and 3. Gas pocket detected in tunnel 4. Recommend immediate evacuation." I looked around the tunnel where I stood. Section 3, according to my map. As Frank's voice listed safety violations through my radio, I noticed details I'd missed before. Hairline cracks in the ceiling directly above my head. Support beams that were bent under pressure they were never designed to handle. The smell of methane gas seeping through the rock. Frank wasn't warning about Shaft 5 anymore. He was warning about where I was standing right now. I ran, stumbled through the dark tunnels with my flashlight bouncing off walls that seemed to be closing in around me. Behind me, I could hear the groan of stressed timber and the whisper of settling rock. The mountain was moving, adjusting itself around voids that had been carved out nearly a century ago. I made it to the main shaft and climbed toward daylight, my radio still crackling with Frank's warnings about dangers throughout the mine. Gas leaks, unstable ceilings, support structures that had been compromised by decades of freeze-thaw cycles and seismic activity. When I reached the surface, I called the Alaska Department of Natural Resources and reported the structural dangers. They sent an engineering team to assess the mine the following week, and their findings were sobering. The entire eastern section was on the verge of collapse. The tunnels I'd been exploring were death traps held together by rotting timber and wishful thinking. The engineering report recommended that the mine be permanently sealed to prevent future accidents. But here is the part that still gives me nightmares. When I asked the lead engineer about Shaft 5, he looked confused. According to the Geological Survey, there was no Shaft 5 in that section of the mine. Never had been. The tunnel I detected with ground-penetrating radar didn't match any of the original mining plans. Shaft 5 didn't exist, had never existed, but Frank Kozlowski had died trying to inspect it 70 years ago, and his voice was still trying to save lives by warning people away from dangers that were all too real. I've been back to Kennecott twice since then, always with proper safety equipment and never alone. Frank's voice still comes through on Channel 7, still delivering warnings about structural problems and gas leaks that turn out to be accurate every single time. The locals have started calling him the Mine Guardian, a ghost who refuses to let anyone else die the way he did. Tour groups sometimes hear him on their radios, warning them away from areas that look safe but hide fatal dangers just beneath the surface. Last month, Frank's warnings saved the life of a teenager who wandered into a restricted section of the mine. The kid's radio picked up the familiar message about ceiling instability, and he evacuated just minutes before tons of rock came crashing down in the exact spot where he'd been standing. I've tried to research why Frank's voice can reach across decades to warn the living about dangers in the mine. Some psychic investigators think he is trapped by unfinished business, doomed to repeat his safety warnings until everyone finally listens. Others believe the mountain itself holds memories of the dead, broadcasting their final thoughts through the copper deposits that honeycomb the rock. I have a different theory. I think Frank Kozlowski loved his job so much, cared about safety so deeply, that not even death could stop him from protecting people in those tunnels. He is still there, still watching, still trying to prevent the accidents that corporate negligence made inevitable. And maybe that is the most terrifying part of all. Not that the dead can speak to us, but that some of them care enough about the living to never stop trying to save us from ourselves.